The late German statesman Konrad Adenauer once said, "History is the total sum of things that could have been avoided." Adenauer, of course, was speaking in the post-World War II period, but with Cold War rhetoric being bandied about again today across the media airways with that same talking point of Russian aggression, it almost feels inevitable that we're careening toward World War III. But why do politicians continue to refuse to learn from empire's past mistakes? And why are they reading past atrocities as a how-to manual for running the world today? NATO, for example, was born in 1949 as war-devastated European countries were struggling to rebuild their war-torn landscapes, industries, and economies. And the United States sought assurances against a resurgent Germany and incursions from the communist Soviet Union. Now, the United States, Canada, the UK, and several other Western European nations jumped on board the intergovernmental military alliance supposedly geared toward peacekeeping endeavors. But as the world soon learned, it was actually created to tackle the burgeoning Cold War, a fight billed as democracy versus communism, the Western Bloc versus the Eastern Bloc. But this so-called peacekeeping mission has already left up to 40 million civilians, or even more, dead since its inception. As the Cold War was finally coming to an end and the Soviet Union was dissolving 4 decades after NATO's inception, the United States agreed not to expand NATO and to respect Russia's borders. Yet despite this agreement, it should come as no surprise that the United States would not just sit back as Russia's role in European gas markets started to threaten U.S. hegemony in the sector in recent years. It made inroads with Russia's neighbors, prompting a tug-of-war over Ukraine. U.S. leaders like John McCain even supported and armed neo-Nazi fascists who staged a coup there, then ushered in corporations like DuPont, Monsanto, and Wall Street's George Soros so U.S. companies could have a monopoly over Ukraine's industries. And when Russia signed off on a deal between its gas giant Gazprom, Iran, and Iraq to build a gas pipeline through Syria and into Europe, the United States and its allies in the Middle East waged a bloody proxy war there. They armed right-wing rebels and jihadists to destabilize Assad's Syria, a Russian ally, and oust the Assad government in order to replace him with someone who would be more accommodating to U.S. interests in the region, like they did in Ukraine. And now the Plymouth Institute for Peace Research reported that the Pentagon and NATO have been encircling Russia and China with military bases and missile defense systems, aiming to gain control over natural resources to keep competing markets dependent on the U.S. as well as in line with its interests. Joining me to discuss this very dangerous point of military escalation and what the implications are for this build-up to World War III is geopolitical analyst and founder of StopImperialism.org, Eric Drazier. Take a look. Thank you so much, Eric, for joining me today. The media currently is running on this narrative of Eastern aggression, just as it did during the Cold War, World War II, and nearly every conflict that we see today. It almost seems like the media is cheerleading for World War III rather than act as a watchdog to those thirsty for power. Why is this narrative being parroted, and what is its significance?
Well, I think in asking the question of why this narrative is being propagated so extensively, it serves us well to remember that narratives are a product of a media system, of a controlled corporate media matrix. And that is really what we have in the United States and in the West, generally speaking. It's probably useful to remember that in the United States, for instance, 6 corporations control more than 90% of our media, and those corporations are deeply interconnected with the military-industrial complex, deeply interconnected with, of course, the political establishment, the ruling elites, the ruling class, and so on. And so when we talk about the media and the creation of narratives, we have to remember that the media is, in effect, an appendage of the ruling establishment. the public relations arm of the imperial system. And I should be clear, when we say imperial system, we mean a global empire that really has no parallel in history. An empire with its centers in New York and Wall Street, in Washington, in London, in Brussels, Paris, Tel Aviv, certain other capitals around the world. This globalized system, it is the one that is stoking conflict in Eastern Europe and Ukraine. It is pushing against the very western borders of Russia, stoking tensions in the Baltic. It is, of course, waging war in Syria, in Libya, all throughout the Middle East and North Africa region. It is moving ever closer to China, stoking conflict in the South China Sea, attempting to encircle China. You see all of these moves, and that is really, I think, what your question is alluding to when you're talking about this narrative. We see that the media is, in effect, front and center in trying to sell war hysteria, warmongering, belligerence, and imperialism here in the West. Ultimately, that is the function of the media, and sad to say, they're doing a pretty good job of it. If you look at the public opinion polls, if you look at how people think about countries like Russia and China, you begin to see that a lot of the stereotypes, a lot of the traditional Russophobia, a residue of the Cold War, that is being brought back to the surface. Similarly, racist attitudes against China, colonial, I would say, attitudes against a number of non-Western countries, all of this is coming to the fore precisely because the imperial system is in such a precarious situation with a global economic crisis, with conflicts raging in every corner of the world. And so that's why it seems that the world is so chaotic, and that's why it seems that the media is feeding into it.
And you mentioned briefly Ukraine, and the United States did back a neo-Nazi and corporate coup in Ukraine successfully, all for control over Russian gas in Europe. And now U.S. troops are being deployed to Syria for combat, obviously after Obama said for years that he wouldn't do that. And this is obviously ahead of supporting jihadists and supposed moderate rebel groups for the past several years, all again for the sake of controlling gas heading to Europe. Is this a form of direct confrontation with Russia, and what are its implications?
Well, I suppose it would depend on how we define direct confrontation. In my mind, that would imply some kind of a hot war or a shooting war. I think rather we're seeing a series of what could be called proxy conflicts, wherein the United States is doing what it can to undermine Russia's political and economic development, trying to undermine Russia's growing ties with Europe. I think that that's really part of the way in which we need to understand what the U.S. has done in Ukraine. Essentially, the U.S. has attempted, sure, it's about gas and gas transit and pipelines and fracking and all of these energy-related issues, but at the larger geopolitical and strategic level, the U.S. Attempts and fomenting of chaos and coup and overthrow of a government in Ukraine is designed to drive a wedge between Russia and Europe. Europe, which is very much dependent on Russian energy, as you were alluding to, for its own economic survival. Russia, of course, being dependent upon European capital, European exports, and so forth. And what the United States is seeing is that its hegemony in Europe in the post-World War II space, that is fading away. It is becoming a relic of the past. And so in order for the U.S. to extend its hegemony, it needs to split Russia from Europe. It needs to divide these two very powerful regions, or country. One is being a country, one being a supranational entity. You can see very clearly, for instance, Russian and German economic ties with the Nord Stream pipeline. German industry heavily dependent upon Russian energy, and the U.S. sees a threat in all of this. That is essentially the backdrop against which you have to understand what the U.S. has done in Ukraine. simultaneously, this is part of a broader pattern, a broader project of NATO expansion, which has been ongoing for 25 years now. The former Soviet states in the Baltic, the former Soviet state of Georgia, Republic, I should say, of Georgia, Ukraine, and so forth, the Balkans as well. All of these, which were traditionally seen as the Soviet sphere of influence, the Soviet bloc, all of that has been gradually stripped away and pulled into the sphere of influence of NATO, the NATO-US orbit. And so thinking about these issues in Eastern Europe, for instance, you have to see them as part of a broader political strategy by the United States, by the West, in order to isolate and ultimately dismember and bring to heel Russia and China. And of course, Russia's counter moves against that have been to move closer to China and some of the other non-Western countries. So there is this great game, so to speak, playing out all over the world. And I think that that's really what we're witnessing in a place like Ukraine. Moreover, I just want to add really quickly, it is also yet another illustration, yet another example of the United States with its long and sordid history of support for Nazis and for fascists. The U.S. has done it all throughout Europe since World War II. It has done it in many parts of the world, including the fascists that are in control of the so-called State of Israel. So you have this tendency of the United States to support fascism and Nazism precisely in those places where fascism was forcibly destroyed, most specifically by the Red Army during World War II. There is a historical trajectory that has led us to this point, and we shouldn't ignore it.
But many people would argue that China and Russia and the U.S. alike are all imperialist states or have been at some point in their history. So what's the difference today with everything that we're seeing and everything that you just laid out and framed for us? Is there a good guy in all of this?
Well, I think it's a deliberate distortion on the part of many people, some who maybe don't know better, some who should know better, and some who do know better, to say that Russia and China are quote-unquote imperialists. The definition of imperialism, whether you want to use the standard way that it is used today, whether you want to use the far more sophisticated definition formulated by Vladimir Lenin in his famous work, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, no matter how you look at imperialism, I think it is clear from an objective analysis that there is only one empire in the world today. It is a global empire, a corporate empire, we could call it that. And if you look at a country like Russia with its vast natural resources for export, but little else in terms of finance capital, no monopoly control of global markets with the exception of its energy exports, no penetration of the global financial architecture, entirely dependent upon the Western system of credit, of financial transfers, and so forth. Absolutely no penetration of the global finance market. I believe there's only one Russian bank in the top 100 global banks in terms of size and in terms of dollar holdings. So there is no decent definition for imperialism that Russia fits. Now, one could argue that Russia is a capitalist state with imperial intentions in the future. Okay, I think that that's also a somewhat discredited argument, but people can make it. The same is true of China. China is not in search of markets that it can dominate and control in the way that imperial powers often and actually always are. Rather, China is interested in investment. China is interested in mutually beneficial arrangements, nothing like the colonial imperial model that Europe used all throughout the last 4 centuries. And so I'm very, very cautious with people who make the argument that Russia and China are imperialist states. Rather, the way that it needs to be understood, I think, objectively, is the global imperial system seeks to destroy or otherwise subdue nations that are attempting to assert their sovereignty, that are attempting to develop their own political, economic, social, cultural, maybe even religious institutions. And that is how Russia sees it. That is how China sees it. Matter of fact, that's how most of the world sees it. it outside of the imperial bubble? And so I think that this is a fundamental question that really needs to be asked. What is the global imperial system, and what forces are emerging to counteract its influence? And that is the principal role that Russia, China, India, Iran, Brazil, a number of countries in Latin America, many others around the world, that they are increasingly finding themselves pulled into this non-Western counter system. And I think that from the perspective of global peace, that's absolutely essential. If we want to maintain peace, there's going to have to be some kind of balance restored in this world. There cannot be one imperial hegemon routing and destroying countries all over the globe as it sees fit. That is unsustainable.
And as you speak of this resistance and, like organizations and pacts like the BRICS, standing up against this kind of corporate and imperialistic takeover, are we living amid World War III, or is this just a build-up to it? I mean, this is on the minds of many people. Of course, most Americans have no clue this is happening, but many of us involved in the media who see it every single day are asking these questions. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, look, I think we do live in a very dangerous time, and I think that it is entirely reasonable to ask such questions and to think that way. Now, on the one hand, I tend to shy away from doomsday prognostication too much. I don't think it's particularly helpful, and I certainly don't think that it is an inevitability. I reject that sort of fatalistic outlook. At the same time, I think that history has shown that the trajectory of world events is leading towards some kind of a global conflict. Now, the nature of that conflict, I think, remains to be seen. What the battle lines will be, of course, certainly remains up in the air. But look, I've spoken on this a number of times. I've written about it. I've spoken about it in interviews. Take a look at the history. 1914, you have the beginning of World War I, a global catastrophe that really brought the entire world into the conflict. 1814, or the early 19th century, is the Napoleonic Wars, engulfing the entire European continent, killing millions, creating conflict on unimaginable scale up to that point. 100 years earlier, 1710, 1715, the War of Spanish Succession, two imperial powers coming together in a conflict in order to divide up colonial possessions, to divide up influence and control over the European continent in the remnants of the Spanish Empire, which had already essentially collapsed by that point. 100 years earlier, you have the 30 Years' War, engulfs the entire continent of Europe, so-called the Western world, kills millions, recreates the global chessboard, if you will. All of these wars in their time, within their context, were seen as world wars, given, what the world was of the 17th century, of the 18th century, of the 19th century, or of the 20th century. They were seen as world wars. They were catastrophes of epic proportion and on an epic scale, with more casualties than previously could have been imagined in wartime. Now, bringing us forward to today, we are almost exactly 100 years after the start of World War I. We have a pattern where the last 5 centuries have been essentially begun, or in the early part of the century, shaped by a global war of massive proportions. So it's entirely reasonable to believe that the same thing is happening now. And in each of those examples that I laid out, you saw one empire in its phase of decline, in conflict with another empire in the beginning stages of its ascendance, of its rise. And I think that inherent tension between declining powers and emerging powers shapes these global conflicts, and there's a reason why they run on a more or less roughly 100-year cycle, because that is the cycle of imperial succession in this world that we live in. So yes, it's a very dangerous time, a very scary time. Global conflict is very much a possibility. Now, all of that being said, it is the responsibility of people like you, people like me, people of goodwill around the world to do everything we possibly can to prevent such a catastrophic outcome. And that means activism, that means means informing people. That means creating networks of solidarity, rejecting warmongering in every form, whether under the cover of imperialism, whether under the cover of humanitarianism, whether under the cover of national security. We have to reject all of these wars, and we have to reject the economic and political system that feeds off of them. We have to reject all of these things and create an alternative. If we can move in that direction, maybe, just maybe, we can prevent another world war.
Well, thank you so much, Eric. That was a very informative interview. I really appreciate you coming on, and I hope to talk to you soon. And we're all wishing for peace. Thank you.
Thank you.